Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today who is involved in creating a better tomorrow on some really unique fronts. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Sandeep Patel, who is Director of the Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures, or DRIVE, at the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA, which is a U.S. Department of Health and Human Services office that's responsible for the procurement and development of medical countermeasures, principally against bioterrorism, but also including chemical, biologic, radiologic, and nuclear threats, as well as pandemic, influenza, and emerging diseases. Dr. Patel is committed to advancing high-impact science, building new products, and launching collaborative programs and initiatives with public and private sector to help advance human health and wellness. And as the DRIVE director, he leads a dynamic team that's built to tackle these complex national health security threats by rapidly developing and deploying innovative technologies and approaches that draw from a broad range of disciplines. Prior to DRIVE, Dr. Patel served as HHS Open Innovation Manager, where he was focused on advancing innovative policy and funding solutions to complex, longstanding problems in healthcare, specifically focusing on KidneyX, which was a really fascinating public-private partnership to spur the development of an artificial kidney and execute the Advancing American Kidney Health Initiative. Prior to his tenure at HHS, Dr. Patel was a co-founder of Amusono Labs, which is a 3D printing and prototyping service. He served as a scientific analyst with Discovery Logic, the Thomson Reuters company, as well as was a Mirzayan Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Academy of Sciences. He was also a scientist at the nanotech startup Kava Technology. Dr. Patel holds a variety of dozens of peer-reviewed articles in areas like nanotech, chemistry, innovation policy, and kidney health. He earned his Ph.D. in physical chemistry from the Georgia Institute of Technology, his bachelor's degree in chemistry from Washington University in St. Louis, and just a lot of really exciting and interesting topics to get into with him today. All that being said, Dr. Sandeep Patel, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks, Ira. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great having you, Sandeep. I mean, you've been on this amazing journey in research and innovation and entrepreneurship. I'd like to just go back for a few minutes to the beginning. If you could take just a little time to further introduce yourself in terms of, what got you interested in chemistry originally, a little bit of this dissertation topic on photophysics of fluorescent silver nanoclusters, and a little bit of sort of what set you on this amazing journey you've been on the last several years.
Yeah, so I can let me start with why I got into science. I find science fascinating. I've always loved science as a kid. Loved math. Was that kind of a kid who just really gravitated towards all that. But I also am a person who just can't pay attention to one thing all the time. So just I always wanted to diversify. I actually was started off as an English and philosophy major in college. So I did a 180 for my earlier science focus, and got to really appreciate different ways of thinking and all that kind of stuff. And then I gravitated back into science later in college. I actually switched back to being a chemistry major. I ended up did major in chemistry in undergrad. And from there, jumped into this sort of world of research and physics and chemistry and nanoscience and all that kind of stuff. And the couple of things that I'll sort of mention from that is one is that I like love being at the edge of discovery. I think that being at that point where you're discovering knowledge that no one else in the world has or ever had is just really exciting and unique. And unless you've done that before, it's just kind of hard to imagine what that feels like. One of the things they tell you about when you get a PhD in any field really is that you are the one expert in that one specific area. No one knows that more than you do at that particular point in time. And it's just kind of cool, right? It's just fun and exciting. I also came to appreciate while I was in grad school, again, back to this philosophy of looking at sort of multiple ways of thinking about problems, which is something kind of a theme I'll get back to. I also became really interested in sort of why we do what we do in research and basic science. So I was working on developing these small nano clusters of silver and gold. And what was interesting about them is they had these really unique photophysical properties. They were extremely bright, sensitive. They were modular. You can do all sorts of things with them. They also had really interesting basic photophysics that we just didn't understand, why they did what they did. And so we were uncovering some of that. We also got money from NIH and from NSF and from DARPA and others because there was all sorts of potential use cases for this. And the potential use cases was kind of fascinating, right? You don't really think about that when you're working in the lab doing this stuff. We were talking about how this could be used as a sensor for early cancer detection, how these could be used for, novel materials that NSF and others were interested in. So I just became fascinated by that process because it was such a black box to me. Like, how do you take what we were doing and turn it into something real and scalable and commercial and, out in the real world? And so anyway, that opened the whole door for me into that world and thinking about those steps and those sequences along the way.
And continuing along those lines, because clearly, as I mentioned in the bio, you nowadays, and not just with BARDA, but what you did before with the KidneyX program, you focus on really big issues. We call them moonshots, moon landings, whatever you want to call them. And we chatted a bit before the show about we are a country that spends a tremendous amount on healthcare. We have an amazing innovation ecosystem. Yet when it comes to these big topics, you really got to put teams together. You have to have these interdisciplinary groups that don't normally work together. I came across a fascinating paper from 2019 that you were involved in. It was called A Vision for Advancing American Kidney Health, and it was focused on the KidneyX program. And you basically talk about, look, dialysis, it's got to go the way of things like, the iron lung and other sort of antique technologies that we don't use anymore. But to do it, we got to bring together everybody, service providers, product developers, investors, people from different sort of biologic disciplines. Talk a little bit about what you learned during that period of time in terms of not just the collaborative nature of these big projects, but also the public-private partnership model.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. Let me start from like the high level because I think it's important to kind of frame this out. I think the challenge before us, right? Something that I always think about, and everything that I work on kind of fits into this bucket is that the problem you laid out, right? We spend more in the U.S. per capita on healthcare than any country in the world. We have one of the lowest life expectancies, however, among developed nations. And you add on top of that the fact that, arguably we probably have the most productive innovation ecosystem in the history of human existence right now, right here. Yeah. And so, that paradox is both fascinating and disturbing, but, presents an opportunity. And so the question is, how do you guide all of that in a real tractable way? How do you take the amazing innovators across multiple disciplines, across multiple parts of, the US economy, communities, and how do you channel that to effectively improve human health and wellness, right? Not just for people today, but people in the future, right? That's sort of the big challenge in front of us, right? And so, unsurprisingly, I think, one of the things that that I've learned along the way is that most of these problems, they're not, we tend to treat them as either R&D problems or policy problems or societal cultural problems, but they're really all interrelated. And I think the hardest, most obvious problems, are sort of cross-cutting. And I can't think of one that's actually, well, there's many of them, but one good example of this is the problem of dialysis. This is the problem of organ shortage, right? So, just to lay this out, every year, 100,000 Americans experience kidney failure and begin dialysis.
Yep.
And dialysis is a technology that was invented many decades ago. It will hit the top 10 list of medical marvels and inventions of the 20th century because it did something that we couldn't do before, which was save a person's life after they experienced kidney failure. But the problem is that we invented it, we institutionalized it, and we froze it, right? We and we didn't improve upon it. And I think most importantly, we didn't, think about the human at the sort of recipient of that. So the challenge before us now, I started looking at this problem and started realizing, hey, we're still using dialysis. It looks the same as it did 40 years ago. It's a little bit fancier, but it's essentially the same thing. And the fact that, effectively it's still a death sentence, right? And once you're on it, your only option is to get a transplant, and there aren't enough transplants in the world. And so the way we thought about this problem when we came to it, there's sort of two observations that I made. I was in the secretary's office at HHS, and so we if you don't know HHS, I'm going to go on a slight tangent here and then come back.
Please.
If you don't know HHS, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, it's a fascinating organization. It's a part of the U.S. government. It's a holding company-like structure that has multiple agencies that pretty much all touch people, everybody's life, every second of their day in the U.S. In ways that most people probably don't realize. We have, it has the largest biomedical research funder in the world, the National Institutes of Health. We have the Food and Drug Administration, which, depending on the state of the economy, regulates the safety and efficacy of like 20-25 cents of every consumer dollar spent in the US. You have Medicare, operated by CMS, a large insurer that drives a lot of healthcare business. You have CDC, public health stewards. You have all of these components in here. And the interesting thing about dialysis is that this is a problem that kind of fell through the cracks across all of these because on the one hand, you have Medicare that pays for dialysis. By the way, dialysis and ALS or kidney failure, sorry, I should say, is one of the only conditions that automatically triggers eligibility for Medicare. So if you're 18 years old and your kidneys fail, you are eligible for Medicare, and CMS will largely pay for dialysis. And so, but between that and research agendas and FDA, it's one of those problems that we just hadn't coordinated around innovation in this space. Like, how could we do better? What is an alternative to dialysis? How do we incentivize the market? How do we bring the right smart people to bear on this problem? And so, what we ended up doing was just saying, okay, so on the one hand, we need to articulate a visionary problem that lends itself to people kind of making that connection in their head, like, I have something to contribute to this problem. I think that was one of those things that didn't really exist. It felt like a really hard problem. Everybody kind of knew somebody who had a kidney transplant, and so they could empathize with some issues here, but no one had put this in terms that it became solvable, right? And so that's what we set out to do. We created this partnership called KidneyX, which set an agenda to say we need alternatives for dialysis. We need to develop implantable artificial kidneys. We need to develop bioartificial regenerative kidneys and other options that are going to be viable replacements. And what was interesting about this is that our goal was to attract engineers and material scientists and designers and people from different walks of life around this problem and around KidneyX. And to some extent, we started doing that, right? People came up from all over the U.S. and started talking to us about, how they thought about the problem and, potential solutions and stuff. So I think we started creating a groundswell of movement. But the thing I realized from that was that this problem isn't just a research and development problem. This isn't just let's build a fancy widget and get it out there and we're going to solve everybody's problem. This is much more complex and nuanced, and we realized there was a reimbursement incentive problem that the healthcare payers have didn't. There's an opportunity to set the right incentive for them to encourage investment in this space, and it's not something they think doing, right? That's not a lever that they usually think about having, but they have an enormous amount of leverage in terms of driving investment in technology areas, right? You have, opportunities around other policy issues, right? So the fact that it is very difficult to donate a kidney. There's lots of policy issues around how we manage donations, both from living and deceased donors, right? And so there's huge opportunities there. And so what we ended up doing was creating this larger policy initiative around advancing kidney health, focused on this organ shortage problem of like, how do you plug that gap between the people who need organs and the people who organs we could deliver to them. And so part of that solution was technology. Part of that solution was improving organ donation policies. Part of this was just better engagement and communication and community building and stuff like that. So that was sort of my lesson learned there, was that, every problem, even if it feels like a technology problem, is really a much more complex set of problems.
And the pandemic response problem, and I'll put that sort of out there, is, all pandemics. This becomes the BARDA complex problem and your responsibility. And here we have this organization. So you mentioned this holding company and structure, in essence, of HHS. We have BARDA, established about 16 years ago or so, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, reporting into the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response. Talk a little bit about this. Sort of what was going on in 2006. It was sort of the initiative and the sort of the impetus to why this initially started, and a little bit of how we got to the BARDA structure we have today, and then we'll go into Drive a little bit after that.
Yeah, so preparing for pandemics, right? This is another huge, intractable, like very complex problem that I think a lot of people can relate to right now. So BARDA is a fascinating organization. So this sits within the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. This is essentially the emergency response part of HHS. And so BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, it's a 17-year-old organization now. Which is a baby in terms of government years, but the gap that BARDA fills, and it's fascinating, is it essentially, the bread and butter of BARDA is to use public-private partnerships, right, to work with industry to develop life-saving medical countermeasures, so vaccines, therapies, diagnostics, other related technologies for emergency response and preparedness. And products that don't have inherently commercial value or attractiveness, such that the private sector would just do it on their own, right? So BARDA is solving this really important gap, and by leveraging the national interest in protecting Americans against these threats, but leveraging the private sector capabilities for developing, manufacturing, delivering these drugs. And so, with these partners over this 17 years, BARDA has gotten 65 products now through FDA licensure, which, compare that to any single company, right? That's a massive portfolio in a short amount of time. And this includes everything from pandemic influenza vaccines to Ebola vaccines and therapeutics to flu tests to burn treatments to radiation exposure treatments to the COVID-19 vaccines as well, right? And so this is a broad portfolio of technologies that BARDA has. So that's BARDA in a nutshell.
And then you oversee Drive, and as I mentioned in the intro, research, innovation, ventures, and it's clearly more than a sort of a traditional venture capital / grant making model that you have. Take a little time, Sandeep, if you would, to sort of walk us through exactly what's going on there, because it's much more than you just writing some checks to some biotech companies here and there. A lot more going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And the theme with money is that it's easy. Money is cheap, right? I mean, right. You can find money, and it's really expertise in bringing teams together around problems. That's sort of the hard part. But yeah, let me step back a little bit in terms of the team that I run. The reason that I came to BARDA, right? First of all, just going back to what I'm interested in, right? Like, I think, as you look into the future, there's a real need to both identify key problems that if we solve them would really unlock, entirely new capabilities. And these are the kinds of problems that I gravitate towards and I'm interested in. And, I love to bring people from different disciplines together. So when the opportunity to lead Drive came up, and just to give you a sense of timing, I joined BARDA to lead Drive at the end of March 2020. So this was right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, I jumped right in there with this team. But, what Drive is set out to do is sort of looking into the future. When we think about advances in artificial intelligence, in material science, in diagnostic technologies, and all of in synthetic biology, and all of these areas, right? There's enormous potential. We're at so many inflection points with these kinds of things. But, and it's hard to keep track of what's going on across the board. And within the BARDA landscape to think about, well, clearly these are going to improve our ability to prepare for and respond to these health emergencies. But we need a way to guide these capabilities into real products and capabilities, right? And so we need a team that's focused on that, right? De-risking the sort of fanciful into what into something that's real. And so that was why Drive was set up. It was to de-risk some of these sort of crazy advanced, like potentially high impact technologies for that. There's sort of two flavors of well, let me frame it this way. There's really four problems we're trying to solve at Drive. One is the fact that again, as we look into the future for emergencies, one of the difficulties is, I can't predict what kind of emergency is going to pop up and when, right? Like right. There's so many possibilities for these things, whether it's a bioterrorism type event, whether it's a pandemic or emerging infectious disease, whether it's another type of, rad nuke type event. There are so many levels of uncertainty here. And so the challenge is, how do we effectively prepare for all of these scenarios? And the list of things that we need to develop is much longer than the time and money that we have to develop them. So, right, that's our fundamental challenge. And so, but there are ways out of that. And I'll get to that in a second. But that's planning for the unknown is sort of one piece of it. Two is what I would call proof and scale, right? Again, so much exciting technology out there. How do we find what's good? What's useful? How do we select the things that are kind of at the top of the list, and and how do we effectively scale them up, right? How do we de-risk it? How do we, if there's a company that has an exciting technology, but they're missing that one thing, right? What do we do to like support them? So the third challenge is commercial viability. This inherently a BARDA problem, right? Ebola vaccine is not a commercially viable product. And most of what BARDA does isn't commercially viable, but there are opportunities to develop technologies that have both commercial viability and, can be useful in an emergency scenario. And that's sort of another area that we're focused on. And the fourth is what I would call market viability. So we've seen this during the pandemic. To develop a product is one thing, to get it FDA approved and licensed is one thing, but to have impact for people to use it in an effective way when they need it is an entirely different thing, right? And so this gets back to like, how do we effectively design products in a way that has this product market fit? Like people use them, it's accessible, it has usability, all this kind of stuff. So these are really important factors. So anyway, those are the four problems we're trying to solve. Happy to dive into sort of how and why we do some of these things.
Yeah. I mean, I spent some time, going through the existing portfolio, and I encourage everybody listening and watching the show to go check out the Drive site to see the extent of all this. I thought it'd be interesting, Sandeep, just to focus on a few of these different parts of the portfolio. Actually, you've published on, sort of make the connection back to you. And I thought a really interesting place to start would be with sepsis, because here we have a condition that the industry is batting zero, sepsis, whatever. And You had this really interesting paper from back in February 2020 in Critical Care Medicine talking about just sepsis among Medicare beneficiaries and sort of the cost and the impact of this condition. And I found it interesting that in the portfolio you have not just the principle, the host directed therapeutics, where you're not looking at the bug per se, but all the nasty stuff that goes wrong in the immune system and other parts of the body as a result of that, yielding the sepsis, but also this high 3 program where you talk about sort of the general model for how we even where we even put these patients, whether we bring them into the hospital, whether there's ways to deal with sepsis prevention, detection, and other matters. Talk a little bit about sepsis, and if you could sort of link in high 3 and host directed therapeutics, I think that'd be a really nice way to sort of talk about that part of the portfolio.
Yeah, so sepsis is a fascinating example, and it's one that we're as you pointed out, Ira, are very invested in solving for. So, just to frame this out, right? Each year in the U.S., you have about 1.7 million people who develop sepsis, about 270,000 people who die from sepsis each year, and this was pre-COVID numbers. So this is a massive problem generally, and what's sort of fascinating, interesting about this is that we think about sepsis all wrong. And it's one of those terms that has gone through different sort of iterations, and people have different assumptions about what it is. But, our understanding of sepsis now is that, when we experience infection or injury or any type of, we call it insult to the body, in some cases, for some people, they would experience a dysregulation of their immune system, right? Their immune system goes out of whack, both in the short term immediately, but also potentially in the long term. And this causes all sorts of problems. This is what we would call sepsis, and people experience the typical symptoms of sepsis, but this can lead to things like organ failure, so lung failure and acute respiratory distress syndrome or other types of organ failure. And what's disturbing about this is we don't have drugs to treat sepsis. We do not have therapeutics that can rebalance immune systems and treat that sort of fundamental disease that's caused there. And, going back to pandemic preparedness, right? If I told you that, multiple pathogens that, we're concerned with all can cause sepsis in some people, and those who experienced severe versions of those diseases are in fact experiencing sepsis, and that we don't have a drug for that, you would think that there's a major gap in our preparedness posture, and there is, and this is why we're focused on that, because if we had that drug or multiple drugs, ideally, we would be in a much better position to treat biological threat events, no matter what they are, right? So that's sort of one thing. Going back to kind of how we're approaching this from a sort of technological, scientific perspective, I think there's sort of a couple fundamental problems. One is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how people respond to an infection. Some people, we all know this with flu and even COVID and others, some people experience mild versions of the disease. Some people have asymptomatic versions of disease. Some people have extremely severe versions of disease that lead to morbidity and mortality. And at a fundamental level, we don't really understand why. Nor do we have a way to predict and identify and measure those kinds of things effectively. And so there's a huge opportunity from a diagnostic perspective to both at a really early stage, even before you would show symptoms of an infection, to find sort of imbalances in your physiology that might indicate you possibly have an infection. So that's sort of one. And we have tools, we've had studies where we show wearables, for example, can flag possible respiratory infection before you show symptoms, right? Incredibly powerful screening tool potentially. But then, go further and say, like, look, if we can predict, ahead of time, someone who's going to experience sepsis several days later versus someone who's not, that would be an incredibly powerful predictive tool to figure out who do we need to treat first, right? Not only in a normal situation and obviously for the benefit of that patient, but like in an emergency situation when you have hospitals full, like this serves as an extremely useful triage tool to pick out the ones that are most vulnerable and most needed to be treated. So that's sort of one, right, from the diagnostic perspective. I would call that host-based diagnostics, right? Understanding people's physiology, their complex immune systems in a way that provides actionable kind of insights. Now, the flip side of this is there's another problem, right? So even if we know, someone's going to experience sepsis, without adequate sets of treatments for different stages and different people, you still have a gap in your ability to treat that person. And so there's also a huge need to develop what we would call host-directed therapeutics or sepsis drugs, or and it doesn't have to be pharmaceutical interventions. There can be non-pharmaceutical interventions as well. But the point is to sort of rebalance the immune system in different ways, both in the acute and chronic stages, right? So we're heavily invested in this. We have large portfolios around this. There's a lot of really exciting science emerging from immunology and others that are sort of pointing to like new types of therapies that could be useful in this. And so we're trying to take advantage of that emerging science.
Excellent. Sonny, another paper that you published with your BARDA colleagues was this one, seasonal influenza vaccination associated with reduced risk of death, focused on the Medicare beneficiaries again, and vaccines save lives. Yet, all my life, it was always an injection in the arm in a liquid form. But you point out in the Beyond the Needle program that there's a lot of other ways that we could potentially create vaccines and deliver them. All sorts of interesting things that you're doing there and looking at in terms of sensors and patches and with micro needles. Walk us through a little bit of some of the things that excite you in terms of this particular program of Beyond the Needle.
Yeah, I'll bring back this is a fascinating area and a huge opportunity, I think, to make it a big difference in people's lives. So, as that paper, Ira, that you referenced concludes, and a lot of other, work concludes, vaccinations save lives. But yet there are barriers towards accessing vaccines and storing and delivering vaccines. And so, I think one of these areas, going back to this sort of concept of market viability, of human-centered design, right? How do we develop products that people find extremely convenient, right, to use and serve as a point of building trust, right, among people? There's a huge opportunity before us to say, we can deliver vaccines in entirely different ways to people. And one of the opportunities is to use these sort of microneedle skin patches. I wish I had a product with me to show you. That for anyone who can basically slap on a patch on their arm could self-administer a vaccine ideally, right? And so the implications of that are massive if we can kind of prove that out and it makes sense from a safety and efficacy perspective, which is that, both that we can, make vaccines all that more convenient, right? Imagine walking into a retail pharmacy and just going to pick up a patch, and on the way out, you sort of self-administer and you go home and you're done, right? That level of convenience has the opportunity to increase utilization of vaccines in a way that, we sometimes struggle with. And that's just in the US. Now imagine around the world, when you have logistical issues around administering vaccines in a lot of different places, right? This presents an entirely new framework for doing that. There's also additional advantages, which is that our immune response, under our skin is much more sensitive than it is in our muscles, right? And so you can have this dose sparing effect with patches, right? So you can save on vaccine supply. You can even, it's more amenable to single dose vaccinations as well, right? And so again, logistically, the idea is to lower these barriers, these unnecessary barriers for people to access vaccines. The last point on this that I think is really important is that, during COVID, there was there's a point in time when the demand outstripped the supply of vaccines, right? We were trying to roll vaccines out very quickly to a lot of people. And again, logistically, right, you can imagine with a self-administered vaccine, you have the opportunity to do mass vaccinations much more quickly and efficiently than you can through a typical syringe needle model. So again, potentially revolutionary, transformative opportunities there. What we're working on is we're investing heavily in a lot of these emerging companies that have various products. they're working through, some of them are in clinical trials for flu vaccines, for measles, rubella vaccines on patches and things like that. And so they're starting to make some headway and develop some human data. I think we're working through de-risking a lot of the sort of commercial market around this space and thinking about both from a manufacturing perspective, obviously getting towards a sort of the regulatory kind of pathways, but then really thinking about sort of, how do we make this the standard in the future? And again, really exciting stuff. And we're just starting the path with that.
Awesome. Really awesome. Sandeep, one more I'd love to hit on, just because it's been such a hot topic for the show, is this principle of repurposing, that we have, a pharmaceutical industry that's been around for 100+ years, which, they have thousands of products on the market, but probably millions of compounds sitting in libraries somewhere that have been tested on disease X and Y, but never on disease Z. And, my asthma drug may be great for kidney health, or what we just don't know. You have a program called Reboot, repurposing drugs for biologic threats and, potentially antiviral, but also antitoxin applications and so forth. Talk about the role of repurposing here, because again, I see this as something, a tremendous untapped opportunity, but at the same time, in a world where, hey, we might have generic drugs that drug company A, B, and C don't want to develop, opportunities for repurposing.
Yeah, so this is a huge opportunity, and one that as you pointed out, I think we've probably not put in place enough to explore all the possibilities here and make it easy. But just one of the advantages, and going back to commercial viability kind of pillar for us to drive, is finding that threading that needle, right, of what's useful in an emergency scenario and what's commercially viable. And drug repurposing provides one of those opportunities to thread that needle. And I think the opportunity in front of us is fairly clear, is that if you have a drug that's gone through a safety profile, has efficacy data for another use case, the marginal cost and effort to test that drug against another use case that's related to pandemics or anything else under BARDA's mission is marginal, rather than the cost of developing an entirely new drug from the beginning, right? And so from a cost perspective, there's a lot of opportunity there. I think the challenge is twofold. So one is, exploring the full space of possibilities here, right? And getting, what's out there. How, a company that has an asset, how do they know what else could be used for? How do we identify who has an asset and how it can be used for? So there's sort of a communication logistical challenge, and we're working on ways to do more exploratory stuff using kind of AI modeling simulation to kind of identify, potential targets and opportunities for things that we're interested in. We're also trying to think about better ways to communicate with the industry to sort of, develop these kind of partnerships in the future. And so the example of Reboot that you mentioned is a good example. This is actually one program of what I would call a triumvirate of repurposing programs we have. So we have one called Redirect, that's focused on repurposing against chemical threats, the Reboot against biological threats, and then working on one for radiation nuclear exposure as well. Nice. And so all three of these areas, right, are areas where the market for drugs against chemical threats is a fairly small niche market, right? But the conditions that you're treating, right, lung organ failure, respiratory distress, all this stuff has commonalities with commercial indications. You can imagine cystic fibrosis and plenty of other kind of areas. And so it's a matter of kind of combining efforts. And so we're looking for those drugs that have been developed for other purposes that we can kind of add in and test for other our uses as well.
Awesome. Sandeep, when I go to the BARDA Drive website, there's a section on your partnerships, which is as extensive as sort of the different portfolio areas. And, one finds in there pharmacy chain CVS, General Electric, Harvard, major academic institutions, and a lot of startup innovators as well. how do you go about, I mean, what's the process like? If I'm, a small startup company, I have an interesting idea that my drug X may work for Y, want to partner with BARDA. What's the whole process like? How do you go about the whole structure of creating these partnerships?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have, I'll sort of start philosophically with sort of how we, how we think about partnerships, right? And this gets back already your earlier point around not just writing checks.
Right.
So just, I think one way that BARDA generally and Drive specifically too thinks about partnerships with industry is again, not, we don't want to write checks and, just walk away.
Sure.
Um, there's expertise on both sides of the table, and both sides of the table recognize the complementary expertise. And so, we work together with our partners hand in hand, and, their success is our success, and we're working towards that common problem. They have gaps, we have gaps, we're working together, right? And that's sort of the philosophy we bring into it. Drive specifically, I think we typically partner with small emerging startups. But we also work with larger companies. We work with academic centers, both large and small. Our overall goal, right? Our mission is to find that needle in the haystack, right? Is to find technologies that we think are going to have substantial impact for a future emergency. And in order to do that, our search algorithm is essentially, all right, where's all the activity happening? Where's the emerging science? Where's the interesting technologies? A lot of this is at the startup level.
Okay.
And a lot of this is at startup levels in different domains, right? And that presents both an opportunity and a challenge, right? We want to work with these startups. Some of them know what we're doing, and there's sort of a natural connection point. Some of them have no idea that BARDA exists. And so our challenge is, how do we find them, attract them, but also get to that common problem, right? That we think. And so the philosophy we've taken is, all right, we're going to make things easy. As easy as possible. We recognize that startups have limited lifetimes. Oftentimes, time is everything, right? And so we don't have annual funding cycles. We have on-demand, continuous funding cycles. We're trying to meet the companies where they're at. We also recognize that not every company, they don't need one thing. They all need different things, depending on their stage. And so what we've ended up doing is creating kind of an innovation ecosystem of sorts. So we have our direct kind of research and development contract partnerships. One mechanism we have is called the Easy BAA, which is Easy Broad Agency Announcement. This is kind of one of our sort of foundational contracting mechanisms at BARDA, but it's a really rapid mechanism. We can get to awards in as few as 9 days in some cases, but fairly short overall. And so it's an easy way to partner immediately with the company. We typically do small projects, $750,000, 12 to 18 months to prove out something, and then opportunity to kind of see what works. But sometimes companies aren't even ready for that kind of a partnership. They're maybe too early, or they maybe just need something else. So we've created a bunch of services around those needs. And so one of them is a partnership we have with Johnson & Johnson called Blue Knight. So this is a partnership where we've placed 27 now actually companies in one of J&J's J-Labs incubators across North America.
Yep.
And so this companies get the benefit of having an incubator, having access to networks and peers, to J&J mentorship, right? Having a corporate scaling partner as a mentor, but also having BARDA as a partner, right? And so this provides something that some companies want and need. And some companies need other things. They just need networks or anything else. We have a whole accelerator network, which is comprised of 13 accelerators and incubators across the country. They each have their own specialty. And so depending on who the company is, we might shuttle them into one of those kind of nodes in our network to kind of prove themselves out for that. In some cases, companies are just looking for venture funding, and a thought partner in their company development as they go along. So we also have an equity finance, a venture capital funding mechanism. We have a partnership with a group called Global Health Investment Corporation, where they're doing VC deals. They're leading new venture deals. And this is an opportunity to bring health security kind of into the DNA of a company through a mechanism that everyone kind of understands in terms of fundraising. So again, offering all sorts of things depending on what a company needs.
Absolutely. Fascinating. I mean, amazing structure. Just very impressive. So one other thing, I was thinking about and it was, I think, mentioned offline that Operation Warp Speed, and I had Vic Suarez on the show a couple of months ago, talking about his role there. They used BARDA's model, as when COVID came along for the creation of OWS, and it got me thinking of some of these other U.S. government innovation ecosystems that have had folks on from like DARPA, like Office of Naval Research, and so forth. I had Dr. Dave Markowitz on from IARPA a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about his Felix tool, which talks about biosurveillance, and it seemed to have some interesting connections to another program you have called Agnostic Diagnostics. You're looking more for sort of looking at lots of different pathogens that may be out there. They're a little more specific on the engineering front, but talk about how BARDA goes about partnering with some of these other innovation ecosystems. Some of them don't know you exist. That's not good, but it seems like there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination there that could be occurring as well.
Yeah, there's tons of cross-pollination and tons of opportunity and tons we've already done, right? I'll just go back to this accelerator network we've built, right? These are kind of nodes in these networks that
Yep.
allow these groups to, I'll give you an example. We partner with MedTech Innovator out in California,
Okay.
and they have this massive network of medical device kind of companies from all sorts of, use cases and purposes. And so, what they're able to do is both to understand, what we need at BARDA, like what are the gaps in emergency preparedness and response, and to look out for those technologies and companies that may not be thinking about that as their use case. They may have a completely different use case, but then, because MedTech Innovator or First Flight Ventures in North Carolina or M2D2 in Massachusetts or many of the other nodes in our network, because they understand our needs, they can sort of work this early, right? And so they can refer companies that may have an interest to us, and expands our pool. It gets to on our sort of out of our usual suspects kind of framing. They've referred, I think, at least last year, 500 companies over to us for consideration. We've talked to many of them. 25% of Drive's portfolio consists of companies that were referred to by this network, right? So this is incredibly powerful, kind of eyes and ears on the ground for us. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to outreach. There's just so much going on across multiple domains. Artificial intelligence is a whole nother area that I think we need to take advantage of. Digital health. Yep. Lots of stuff going on there that I think has a significant potential impact on our mission space. So we're going to continue to kind of expand our outreach and broaden our breadth at that early stage of what's going out there and how can we steer the development of those advances towards health security.
Excellent. Sonny, what's coming up? What's next? Because, again, unlike your traditional sort of venture capital group, the sun doesn't set here. I mean, this is not, in 5 years, we got to make our money. BARDA Drive goes on. You have a tremendous portfolio. Obviously, we talked a lot about biologic, but you think about chemical and radiological and nuclear, no doubt. What's happening for 2023? Any public-facing stuff in terms of conferences or open houses or other public-facing initiatives that we should know about? Please, anything that I missed, please tell us more.
Yeah, there's a few things going on. First of all, every fall we actually just had it, so I'll just preview it for 2023. Every fall we have our annual meeting called BARDA Industry Day, which is a chance for partners, past, present, and future, to come talk to BARDA and to talk to one another, and form potential relationships and partnerships and things like that. And so we'll preview that. I think that's a great place to kind of get to know BARDA and our priorities for next fall, and details forthcoming on that. In between, there's a lot of events that we typically have. So we have events. Last year we had an innovation summit with J&J as part of our Blue Knight partnership to kind of talk about the portfolio of companies there and what's going on. Just to highlight a couple, there's some really exciting stuff in that portfolio that I think has really transformative implications. We have a company that's looking at doing protein sequencing, right, and trying to bring that into commercial reality, which will have enormous implications for how we develop medical countermeasures of the future. We have companies that are working on. There's one that's working on a solid state strip that can store vaccines, right? And so incredibly potentially transformative for both how we store vaccines, but how we deliver them and the costs associated with all of that. So anyway, there's lots of opportunities. J&J, as part of our partnership, hosts lots of meetings. You should check out our website, drive.hs.gov, if you want to kind of stay updated on those. We do have one upcoming, and unfortunately, I don't have the details on hand, but again, our website will have it. A summit on home and health. And so this is an area that I didn't hit on earlier, but I think it's worth talking about for a few minutes. It's one of those things during the pandemic that I think everyone could relate to, is that home diagnostics became prime time, became accessible to everyone, right? We all had our antigen tests that we used at home for COVID, and there's a lot of activity bringing kind of making home testing a norm, and lots of exciting work going on there, right? And especially with infectious disease, panels, flu, RSV, COVID, huge potential there. Right. What we're seeing as we look ahead is, there is an opportunity in the context of an emergency to really triple down on this capability, right? If we had the ability at home to both understand when we have an infection, to be able to detect and diagnose that infection, and to do things like standard lab assays at home to kind of figure out your state of wellness, like huge opportunity generally for convenience and just actionable information, right? But also a real benefit for an emergency outbreak scenario, right? When you think about community transmission sites, right? Hospitals, clinics, these are prime areas where transmission can occur. To have the ability, during COVID, just to take a step back, we did see a revolution in telehealth, for example. Yep. All of us suddenly got on our video calls with primary care physicians, but the part that was missing was the sensing part, right? We still had to go in and get our standard lab blood work if that was needed for an annual checkup, or if you have a chronic condition that happens much more frequently. And so these are still bottlenecks in real telehealth, telemedicine kind of engagements. And in a situation where we have to do that, or we're trying to avoid community transmission, having those capabilities, kind of a full suite of those capabilities at home, is going to be extremely powerful. So we have a bunch of programs on that front, talking about how we're investing in that space, talking about how we're looking for additional partnerships in novel sensing technologies that could enable kind of multiplexed sensing at home. But also to talk about the challenges before us, right? Just going back to like the holistic nature of this, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot that needs to be worked out for this to become a reality at scale, right? There's both a cost issue, there's a public acceptance utility issue, right? What do people actually want to know about themselves, and how do we design products to kind of meet that instead of shoving products into people's homes? And I think kind of figuring that out is important. The payment incentives is a huge piece of this, right? How do we set up so payers and the healthcare reimbursement system are having aligned incentives towards some of these technologies, and also to think really about what are the real use cases that make sense to have. And so I think a lot of this stuff needs to be worked out. So we have a meeting coming up next year to kind of bring a bunch of stakeholders together. We'll have payers, we'll have investors, we'll have patients and people. We'll have technologists, we'll have government stakeholders as part of this meeting, and again, check out our website for the details of when that is.
Awesome. Yeah, we will put a link in the bio to that, and we should definitely do a follow-up episode, because that's a perfect example again of how sort of the dual use, you create it for this purpose, but then there's a tremendous, literally $1 trillion market over here for the smart home, healthcare at home, and those themes are again very hot and really are the future. So no, it's just so exciting seeing how all this connects. And I'm rooting you on, Sandeep, you and the whole team there, and I said definitely we should do a follow-up in the new year as some of these new programs come online. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, again, you've been listening to Dr. Sandeep Patel, Director of the Division of Research, Innovation and Ventures at the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Sandeep, I really want to thank you for taking the time to go through everything you're up to there. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing for the United States and keeping us safe. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people out there via what you're doing. It's just such an impressive story.
Yeah, thank you. It's there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this front, Ira. I think we, as we all appreciate, and I do have one last point that I think is important to highlight on this.
Take the floor.
Which is we talk about technologies, we talk about capabilities, but we don't often talk about people.
Right.
And I think the people part is the most important thing. I think investing in entrepreneurs, in just smart, multifaceted thinkers who can really go after these problems, bringing people together in new ways, developing workforces around problems. These are just critical parts. So it begins with our team. Like I have an incredible team at Drive. They're brilliant people. They come from different perspectives. We have ex-investors and ex-DARPA folks, and people from industry, people from different disciplines in science, and lawyers, and all of these people that just bring all these really interesting perspectives to bear. And I think that's important. We look for the same thing in our partners. We're trying to bring really smart people from all different perspectives kind of together around these problems. And so again, super important. I think investing in people is the most important thing. And I just really appreciate being around so many great people all the time.
Yeah, it seems like you have an extremely impressive team there to add to all this. Just again, I really appreciate the time, Sandeep, and appreciate the fact that you're doing all this. And at the end of the day, coming back to keeping us safe and healthy, and it's just so impressive. So really, thank you for the time today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ira. This is a great conversation.